I will, in today's talk, try to start off by providing a little bit of a bigger context in my introductory remarks, zooming in eventually on the case of investment firms and why it is appropriate to review their prudential treatment at this point of time. I will dampen your hopes on providing the Commission's views on the EBA advice, given that the EBA advice is not yet entirely final. But I'll provide you with a few hints on how we think about the advice, the objectives that we think are important when we are now positioning ourselves on how to incorporate that advice once finalized into law. And so I hope that will still be meaningful for the majority of participants here. Now, in terms of broader context, I think the last 2 years of the Commission has been very different, perhaps difficult, but different from the preceding 5 ones. I was previously solely focused on banking regulation, hence the name of the title of the unit where I'm working. And banking legislation, as you know, financial crisis has been in a particular mindset, fix the system. Now, the last 2 years have been a little bit different in that respect. We have paid much more attention on how we reconcile the twin objectives of financial stability and efficient financial intermediation, and try to address any trade-offs to the extent that there are between these two objectives. I was quite heavily involved in the call for evidence process that set in motion a kind of a renewed thinking about this in DG FISMA, about how we achieve these different objectives at the same time. How do we make regulation proportionate to risks that different types of firms face? How do we properly assess the interaction between different pieces of regulation, different regulatory instruments, in a better way than perhaps what we've done in the past? How do we address potential inconsistencies? And the call for evidence gave rise to a lot of food for thought on how we need to improve the way we handle things in that respect. And in that respect, I think the investment firms are an interesting case in point. Now, because they are regulated under different instruments, conduct rules under MiFID, prudential treatment under the CRD, etc. They involve a lot of different actors that are subject to a wider range of legislations as well, be it in the fund management space and elsewhere. They operate in markets which are regulated by yet another broader range of regulations. And all this we have to take into account, assess, and understand. Now, let me turn to perhaps the current approach and how we see that one, because that's the easy part. As you know, the current approach has its roots in the early 1990s, where in a sense there's quid pro quo between, on the one hand, that firms were gaining a passport for providing their services in an integrating European Union, but as a consequence, they also had to respect certain prudential requirements to ensure there was a mutual trust across member states that they are safe and sound. For investment firms, given that they were also in increasing competition with banks, which increasingly at that time also started providing investment services, a judgment was made at the time to subject them largely to the prudential requirements applicable to banks, which by extension were the ones set in Basel. Now, in that respect, I believe the EU is pretty unique among advanced international economies. Prudential requirements, yes, most investment firms around the globe are subject to prudential requirements of a sort in one way or another. But bank-like requirements, that's a different matter. And if you assess that, of course, there are advantages to some extent. Investment firms are today largely subject to standards, prudential standards, which are robust, and on top of that, correspond to the highest international standards. That ensures, which was one of the original objectives, a level playing field with banks, with which investment firms often compete. On the other hand, what we've seen over time, and that is, I think, the real rationale for the review, is that the framework doesn't really fit investment firms. It doesn't really fit the specific type of risks that investment firms face, which sometimes are similar to those of banks, but often are not. And that has given rise to numerous exceptions, special deals, and treatments to try to fit that framework onto investment firms. And as a result, the Prudential framework has over time become increasingly complex, opaque, and difficult to understand, even for informed insiders. On top of it, their requirements modeled on the specific risks of banks doesn't necessarily capture, in a good way, the investment firm risks. Sometimes, and this may lead to very disproportionate requirements, sometimes risks are addressed too harshly or too conservatively. Sometimes, perhaps, specific risk investment firms are not addressed in a sufficient manner. So the system doesn't really work. On top of that, we see quite large differences in the way that member states apply the different standards across the European Union. The extensive difference in the usage of Pillar 2, for example, is one illustration of those differences, where different national supervisors make different judgments and try to achieve a robust prudential outcome in the face of Pillar 1 requirements, which they believe don't fully work. So I think it's difficult to avoid the conclusion that the current framework is not really fit for purpose. It is too complex, it leads to uneven handling of risks, and is differently applied across the European Union. So hence, a review. I think the review is even more important given that we all acknowledge, and I think many of you in the room here do work for investment firms, which are important intermediaries in the financial system in the European Union. Specifically so at this current juncture, where the financial crisis clearly highlighted that Europe as a whole is way too dependent on bank financing and that we need more market financing. And if we need more market financing, investment firms are one of the important intermediaries operating in these markets. And that is, of course, something we want to achieve. Capital Markets Union objective, efficient intermediation of services to kind of bring savers and investors together. So that's why we launched a review with a number of objectives to try to achieve prudential requirements which are more specifically tailored to the risks of investment firms, to achieve requirements which are substantially simpler than the current complex patchwork that has arisen over time, to achieve a system of prudential requirements which is more transparent and readily understandable, and to have a comprehensive treatment of risks across the spectrum and the different actors which are involved. So we want a framework which is prudentially sound, that limits regulatory arbitrage, and importantly, given that we want it to be simpler, also could reduce burdens, both in terms of reporting, compliance, and the like. Which turns me to the kind of forthcoming rules and the work that is being conducted by the EBA. Given that Gabriel is on the panel and will intervene after me, I will not go into any detail, but thanks to the EBA, we now have a much better idea about what a future framework could look like. We have advice starting for 2015, 2016, and the EBA is now, as you well know, finalizing its advice, which we will receive shortly. So we already have a better idea about how that system might look like. As I said at the outset, the Commission has not yet formed a fully fledged view on the detailed EBA requirements, as they are not yet finalized. But in broad terms, I believe that they form an appropriate base on which we can form our proposal, which is, as I said, due a little bit later this year. We will assess the final against the objectives of a review and take a view on how we take it on board and adapt it if required and appropriate. Let me close my remarks with a few preliminary reflections on some of the aspects of the advice. I'll touch briefly on the kind of classes of firms that we see, the K factors, the calibration, and the compliance. Now, starting off with the classes, Natalie, yourself, you alluded to the wide diversity of investment firms and type of businesses they perform, and not only in terms of size, but also in business models and the like. So I think it is entirely appropriate that you try to divide that population up a little bit along the lines suggested by the EBA. So I agree that systemic firms, depending on how you measure it, should remain subject to the bank-like requirements because they do fit them, but that the other firms should move to a new system tailored to their different size and complexity and riskiness. And hence, the forthcoming kind of Class 2, Class 3, I think is broadly an appropriate base on which to form that work. Obviously, we will pay close attention to the final advice when it comes to the dividing lines between the different classes, notably between Class 2 and 3, and to understand the impact that will have. On the K factors, very promising, I believe. I think that our final view on them will be based on the degree to which they achieve a simple framework, a comprehensive treatment of risk, and proxies which are clearly modeled on the business that investment firms undertake. Do the K factors achieve that? In broad terms, I think yes, but we're still also assessing. Calibration will obviously be key, linking back to my initial remarks. How do we square a system that should be prudentially sound with, at the same time, not unduly hampering investment firms' ability to provide market financing? That is something which is quite key and where we will study the final advice with a lot of attention. And compliance. This, the investment firm review for Commission insiders or Brussels insider is a so-called refit initiative, which is beautiful bureaucratic speak for an initiative that is particularly aimed at trying to reduce burdens, compliance burdens, and the like. So that is obviously will be key when we assess with our advice to see the extent to which the system significantly reduces the burdens of complying with the new system. I believe that it largely does, but we will carefully assess that as well going forward. So, I think this is, to conclude, I think this is the first dedicated review done at the EU level since the inception of prudential requirements of investment firms, and I think it was high time. It is likely to lead to a fairly significant change in the way that we regulate these prudential requirements. And as in any kind of change, there will inevitably be distributional consequences. To a large extent, I believe that this is legitimate and desirable, given the way the system is currently performing, or perhaps not sufficiently performing in all cases. But at the same time, of course, given the broader context, we'll try to ensure that any adjustment remains reasonable and in line with the objectives of also stimulating market financing.